I'm Tom Harrison, 72 years old, and this is the story of how my son-in-law learned the biggest mistake of his life, assuming that an old veteran with a military pension was too broken and too poor to fight back. 2 days after we buried my daughter Sarah, my son-in-law Brian walked into my living room and told me I needed to be out of the house by the end of the week. He stood there in his expensive designer suit, arms crossed, looking at me like I was a confused old man who didn't understand how the world worked anymore. I was sitting in my late wife's chair, the one Margaret had loved for 30 years, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I stared at Sarah's funeral program on the side table. My daughter had been gone for 48 hours, and this man was already planning to kick me out of my own home. Before I continue with how Brian learned exactly who he was dealing with, I want to ask you something. If you appreciate stories about justice, about standing up for what's right, about old soldiers who refuse to quit, please hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because this story is going somewhere you won't expect. And leave a comment below telling me if you've ever dealt with someone who underestimated you because of your age. I read every comment, and I'd love to hear your stories too. Brian explained that the house was worth at least $400,000 in today's market and that I couldn't possibly afford to maintain it on my military pension. He figured I was getting maybe $2,000 or $3,000 a month from the VA, barely enough to cover groceries and utilities according to his calculations. He'd already talked to a realtor about getting me into a nice assisted living facility with activities and people my age and medical staff on site. He said I'd be much happier there, that I wasn't getting any younger, that something might happen if I was here all alone. I didn't correct his assumptions about my pension. I just listened the way I'd learned to do during my 26 years in military intelligence, though Brian had no idea I'd spent my Army career doing considerably more than just following orders. He pulled out his phone and started swiping through property listings and valuations. He mentioned that the realtor was coming on Monday to do an assessment and start the listing process. He told me I should start packing whatever personal items I wanted to keep. I told him this was Sarah's house, that Margaret and I had raised her here. He seized on that immediately, agreeing that yes, it had been Sarah's house, but now she was gone and the house went to him as her surviving spouse. That was just how the law worked. He explained in that patronizing tone I'd heard from him so many times before. He almost said he couldn't afford to keep supporting me, caught himself, then rephrased it as the maintenance costs being too substantial for the situation to be sustainable. The word he'd almost used, supporting, hung in the air between us, like I was some charity case living off his generosity. I looked at him then, really looked at Brian Masterson in all his 38-year-old arrogance. Successful real estate agent with his own firm, driving a BMW, wearing watches that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He'd swept Sarah off her feet 8 years ago with expensive dinners and weekend trips and promises of a comfortable life. I'd watched it happen and kept quiet because Sarah loved him and she was happy, and that was all that mattered to me. Margaret had been less convinced from the start. She'd told me a year before the cancer took her that there was something calculating about Brian, that he was always measuring what things cost and what they were worth, that he didn't see people, but rather saw assets. I told her she was being uncharitable. Standing in my living room 2 days after burying our daughter, I realized Margaret had been exactly right all along. I told Brian I'd need some time. He responded quickly that of course I could take the week, that he wasn't a monster, that he understood this was an adjustment. But the realtor was definitely coming Monday, so I really should start packing. Then he left, climbing into his BMW and driving away from the house on Maple Street that he was absolutely certain belonged to him. Here's what Brian didn't know, what he'd never bothered to ask or investigate because he was so completely sure of himself. This house had never been Sarah's property. I bought this place in 1978 with a VA home loan when I came back from my second tour in Vietnam. Margaret and I had been married for 3 years and wanted to start a family somewhere safe and stable. I paid every single mortgage payment for 22 years until the house was completely paid off in 2000. My name was on the deed. My name had always been on the deed. Only my name and Margaret's, never Sarah's. When Sarah married Brian, Margaret and I let them live here because we'd been talking about downsizing anyway, maybe getting a smaller place closer to the VA hospital where Margaret was receiving treatment. Sarah had been so excited about starting her own family in the house where she'd grown up. Brian had simply assumed, the way he assumed everything, that the house belonged to them. We never corrected this assumption because at the time it didn't seem to matter. Then Margaret died 4 years ago. The cancer took her slowly and painfully over the course of 18 months. She spent her final weeks in the master bedroom upstairs, looking out at the garden she'd planted 30 years earlier. Sarah had been there every single day, taking leave from her teaching job to care for her mother. Brian had been noticeably absent, always having important showings or critical client meetings that couldn't be rescheduled. After Margaret passed, Sarah asked if I wanted to stay in the house or if I preferred they move out so I could have my space. I told her to stay. The house felt too big and too empty without Margaret's presence filling the rooms. Having Sarah nearby made the loneliness more bearable. Brian worked long hours anyway, so I barely saw him most days. For 4 years we coexisted in that house. I kept to myself, spending my days in the garage workshop building furniture, visiting my buddies from the VFW, volunteering at the VA hospital. Brian mostly ignored me except when he wanted to make snide comments about my pension lifestyle or question why I needed to keep all that old junk in the garage, by which he meant my tools, my woodworking equipment, and yes, some of my military gear and memorabilia. Then Sarah got sick. It started with headaches she dismissed as work stress. Then came the fatigue, the dizzy spells, the morning she collapsed in the kitchen while Brian was across town showing a property. I drove her to the emergency room. The diagnosis came back quickly and devastatingly. Brain tumor, aggressive, inoperable. She lasted 6 months. I watched my strong, beautiful, intelligent daughter, who'd become a teacher because she genuinely wanted to help children, who'd inherited her mother's kindness and her father's stubborn determination, waste away in a hospital bed over half a year. Brian visited, but not nearly as often as you'd expect from a husband watching his wife die. He always had excuses ready. Client emergencies. Market opportunities that couldn't wait. A big deal that would set them up financially for life. Meanwhile, I was there every single day, holding Sarah's hand, reading to her, telling her stories about her mother and all the trouble the two of them had gotten into together over the years. The night before Sarah died, when it was just the two of us in that quiet hospital room with machines beeping and nurses walking by with soft footsteps, she squeezed my hand weakly and told me she was sorry about Brian. She knew he'd been difficult, she said. She asked me to please try to get along with him after she was gone, told me he wasn't a bad person but that he just didn't understand things the way I did. I promised her I would try. I would have promised her absolutely anything in that moment. She died the next morning with me holding one hand and Brian holding the other, though he'd only arrived 20 minutes before the end because he'd lost track of time at a property showing. The funeral was on a Thursday. We kept it small the way Sarah would have wanted. Some of her teacher friends attended, a few neighbors, and my brothers from the VFW. Joe Martinez, who'd served with me in the 173rd Airborne, Dave Chun, who'd been my intel analyst partner, Mike Peterson, who'd saved my life in a firefight outside Da Nang. They came in their VFW caps and blazers, stood at attention during the military honors I'd arranged because Sarah had always been proud of my service even if she didn't talk about it much. Brian had been annoyed when I told him about arranging military honors. He pointed out that Sarah wasn't in the military and asked if it wasn't all a bit much. I'd explained simply that she was the daughter of a veteran and therefore qualified. He'd rolled his eyes but hadn't fought me on it, probably because he was already mentally calculating the house's value and planning his next moves. At the reception afterward, held at the house on Maple Street with food kindly organized by our neighbor Mrs. Chun, I overheard Brian talking to one of his realtor friends by the buffet table. His voice was low, but not quite low enough. He was saying how tragic it all was, obviously, but between them this actually simplified some things. The old man, meaning me, had been living there rent-free for years. Nice guy and all, but it was time for everyone to move on. He was thinking they'd list at $450, see what interest they got, though the market was hot enough they could probably push for $475 or even $500 if they staged everything right. His friend glanced over at me, standing 15 feet away, clearly uncomfortable that I was within earshot. Brian followed his gaze, saw me watching, and had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. But only slightly. That conversation happened on Tuesday. Thursday morning, 48 hours after we buried my daughter, Brian told me to be out by the end of the week. I spent most of Thursday in my workshop in the garage, sitting at my workbench surrounded by tools I'd collected over 50 years. Some had been my father's, passed down to me before I shipped out to Vietnam in 1969. Others I'd acquired over the decades, good quality equipment that lasted because I maintained it properly and treated it with respect. Brian had once asked me why I didn't just buy new tools from Harbor Freight where they ran sales constantly, and I could get a whole new set for maybe $100. I tried to explain that these tools had history and meaning and had proven themselves reliable over decades of use. He'd looked at me like I was a sentimental fool stuck in the past, unable to adapt to modern efficiency. But sitting there that Thursday morning, I wasn't really thinking about tools. I was thinking about what Brian had said, about how he'd assumed the house was his, about how he'd already calculated its value and planned to sell it, and decided my entire future without asking me a single question about what I wanted or needed or had a legal right to. I was thinking about my daughter Sarah and the promise I'd made to her to try to get along with Brian after she was gone. And I was thinking about Margaret and what she'd said years ago about Brian seeing assets instead of people, measuring worth in dollars instead of recognizing human value. That's when I made my decision about how to handle the situation. I wasn't going to argue with Brian or yell or threaten or make any kind of scene. That's not how you handle situations like this. The military had taught me something valuable during my 26 years of service, and it wasn't just how to follow orders the way Brian assumed. It had taught me how to plan methodically, how to gather intelligence systematically, how to assess an opponent's weaknesses clinically, how to wait for exactly the right moment patiently, and how to execute a mission with precision and discipline. Brian thought he was dealing with a sad old man who'd spent his entire adult life taking orders and now lived on a meager government pension. Someone who'd be easy to push aside and manipulate and forget about once the real estate deal closed and the money was deposited. What Brian didn't know, what he'd never bothered to ask about or investigate because his assumptions were so firmly in place, was who I really was and what I'd actually done during those 26 years in the United States Army. He didn't know that I hadn't been just a regular soldier following orders. He didn't know that after my first tour in Vietnam with the 173rd Airborne Brigade, I'd been recruited into military intelligence. He didn't know that I'd spent the next 2 decades working in signals intelligence, counterintelligence, and strategic analysis, eventually reaching the rank of lieutenant colonel before my retirement in 1995. He didn't know that my specialty had been finding needles in haystacks, tracking down information that people wanted hidden, building comprehensive cases from scattered evidence, identifying vulnerabilities in complex operations. He didn't know that my network of contacts from my military career included lawyers who specialized in veterans' rights, investigators with law enforcement backgrounds, property specialists who understood title law inside and out, and dozens of other professionals who'd served alongside me and who still met up every Thursday night at the VFW to drink coffee and tell old war stories. He didn't know that my so-called meager military pension was actually quite comfortable when combined with my VA disability benefits for the hearing loss and shrapnel scars I'd earned in combat, plus the additional income I generated for 15 years after retirement, doing consulting work for defense contractors who valued my expertise and experience. He didn't know any of this because he'd never asked. He'd just assumed based on his own prejudices about old veterans living on government handouts. And assumption, as I'd learned over and over during my military career, is the greatest enemy of successful operations. Friday morning, I made my first phone call. I contacted Dave Chun and asked if he was still doing property title searches in his retirement. He was, so I requested a complete deed history on 847 Maple Street, every transfer, every lien, every piece of paper associated with that address since 1978. I asked him to keep it quiet for now and said I'd explain everything when I saw him in person. Dave had been my intel analyst partner for 8 years in Germany during the Cold War. If information existed somewhere in a government database, Dave could find it. He'd spent his retirement doing title research and property investigations for a law firm in town. He owed me a favor from way back, and Dave never forgot his debts. My second call went to Joe Martinez. I asked if he still had that connection with his nephew, who'd become a real estate attorney. Joe confirmed that Marcus was practicing property law and elder rights, specializing in cases where people try to take advantage of veterans. Joe said he'd make the introduction. My third call was to Mike Peterson, who'd retired from the Army and then spent 20 years with the state police before retiring again and opening his own private investigation firm. I asked him to run a complete background check on Brian Masterson, finances, business dealings, legal issues, complaints, anything and everything he could find. Mike quoted me his rate and I told him to get started immediately. That money wasn't a concern. The fourth call was the hardest. I contacted Sarah's best friend Jennifer, who taught at the same school. I asked if Sarah had ever talked to her about Brian, about their marriage, about any problems they might have been having. There was a long silence on the phone. Then Jennifer told me carefully that Sarah had loved me so much and wouldn't want her to share things that would hurt me more than I was already hurting. I told her I needed to know regardless. After another pause, Jennifer explained that Sarah had known about the affairs, both of them. She'd found hotel receipts and text messages about 6 months before she got sick. She'd confronted Brian, who'd promised to stop and claimed they were just meaningless stress relief. Sarah had believed him, or maybe just hadn't had the energy to fight about it while dealing with Margaret's cancer treatment and eventual death. Jennifer apologized for not telling me sooner, but Sarah had made her promise to keep it confidential. I thanked Jennifer and ended the call. Then I sat in my workshop for a long time, staring at my tools and thinking about my daughter discovering her husband's betrayals while she was helping her mother die. Brian had been having affairs while both my wife and my daughter were dying. My hands were shaking when I made my 5th call, this time to the Veterans Crisis Line. I clarified immediately that I wasn't in crisis, but needed to talk to someone about anger management, specifically about dealing with grief and rage simultaneously. They connected me with a counselor who listened while I explained everything. Sarah, Margaret, the affairs, being told to leave my own house. I told him about the anger building in my chest, about the old combat training kicking in that made me want to handle this the way we'd handled problems in hostile territory. The counselor talked me through it, reminded me about legal channels and proper methods that wouldn't compromise my integrity or my freedom. He gave me techniques for managing the rage, some breathing exercises, some perspective on separating justified anger from destructive impulses. I thanked him and promised to call back if needed. Then I made one final call to Bill Sanders, my former commanding officer who'd retired as a full colonel and now ran the regional VA office. I asked about property rights for veterans, specifically regarding situations where someone was trying to claim ownership through marriage to a veteran's deceased child. Bill gave me detailed information without asking why I needed it, the way he'd always operated. Then he mentioned that the VA had legal resources specifically for veterans facing property disputes, with lawyers who handled exactly these kinds of situations. I told him I'd keep that in mind, but wanted to see how things developed first. Bill's final words to me were to not let anyone push me around just because I was older now, that I'd earned my place in this world and shouldn't forget it. Saturday, Brian came by to check on my packing progress. I was sitting in Margaret's chair reading a book. He looked around at the complete absence of boxes or packing materials and asked about Monday's deadline. I told him calmly that he'd said I should be moved out by Monday, but I'd never actually agreed to anything. His face flushed. He started to say he was trying to be reasonable and I shouldn't make this difficult. I interrupted by asking when exactly he'd become the owner of this house. The question caught him off guard. He stammered something about community property and marriage, adding that he was sure I didn't understand the legal intricacies, but that was just how things worked. I calmly pointed out that community property only applied to assets acquired during marriage and only in community property states, which Virginia wasn't. Then I asked if he'd ever actually looked at the deed to this house. Something flickered across his face, uncertainty, maybe concern. He claimed Sarah's name was on the deed, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. I asked if he was absolutely sure about that. He stared at me for a long moment, then pulled out his phone, probably planning to call his realtor friend or look something up. But I could see the doubt creeping into his expression, the first cracks appearing in his certainty. He announced that he'd be consulting with his attorney on Monday and strongly suggested I do the same. He claimed to have resources and legal connections and said he wasn't going to let some confused old man try to claim ownership of property that rightfully belonged to him through his marriage to Sarah. I interrupted him calmly. I said that this confused old man had served his country for 26 years, had earned his rank through merit and dedication, probably had more legal knowledge than Brian had accumulated in his entire career, and was telling him very clearly that I wasn't going anywhere. This was my house. It had always been my house. And Brian was about to learn a very expensive lesson about what happens when you underestimate people based on their age. Brian left angry, slamming the door behind him. I heard his BMW engine rev loudly as he sped away, probably racing back to his office to call his lawyer and complain about the stubborn old veteran who didn't know when he was beaten. I went back to my book, but I wasn't really reading. I was thinking about the intelligence reports that would start coming in from Dave, from Mike, from Marcus the attorney. I was thinking about the investigation I'd just launched using skills I'd developed over 26 years in the military, now being applied to a civilian target who had absolutely no idea what was about to hit him. Brian thought this was going to be a simple property dispute that he'd win through superior resources and legal intimidation. He thought he was going to hire an expensive lawyer, push around an old man, and walk away with $400,000 to pay off whatever debts he'd accumulated. What Brian didn't understand, what he couldn't understand because he'd never served, never learned these lessons the hard way through actual combat and intelligence operations, was that this wasn't a property dispute at all. This was a mission. And in 26 years of military service, I had never failed a single mission. Monday morning, I received an email from Dave Chun with a subject line that simply read, "You need to see this immediately." I opened it in my workshop, sitting at the old desk where I kept my laptop. Yes, this 72-year-old veteran knew how to use computers despite what Brian probably assumed about old soldiers and technology. I'd been using military computer systems since the 1980s when most civilians had never even seen one. Dave had compiled a complete property documentation package. The deed history was exactly what I remembered and exactly what I needed. I'd purchased 847 Maple Street in April 1978 for $42,000 using a VA home loan. The only name on the original deed was Thomas Edward Harrison. Margaret's name had been added in 1980 when we refinanced to get a better interest rate. When Margaret died in 2019, her name came off through the standard survivorship process, leaving my name as sole owner. Sarah's name had never appeared on that deed. Not once. Not ever. Not at any point in the property's entire history. I sat back in my chair feeling a mixture of vindication and sadness wash over me. Sarah had known this, of course. We'd discussed it explicitly when she and Brian got married. She'd understood perfectly well that the house was still mine and Margaret's, that we were simply allowing them to live there. But apparently Sarah had never corrected Brian's assumption about ownership. Maybe she'd tried and he hadn't listened. Maybe she'd kept quiet to avoid conflict in the marriage. Or maybe, and this thought made my chest tighten painfully, maybe she'd known that revealing the truth would expose exactly what kind of man Brian really was, and she hadn't wanted to face that reality. Dave's report continued with additional documentation. He'd found building permits for the addition we'd put on in 1985, my name on all the paperwork, my money paying for the construction from my military salary and savings. Permits for the garage renovation in 1992, again, my name, my funds. Property tax records going back to 1978 showed every single payment made from my bank account, never once late, never once missed, an unbroken record of 47 years of ownership and responsibility. There was absolutely no legal ambiguity here whatsoever. This house was mine. Brian had no claim to it. No right to it. No legal standing to demand anything regarding it. Tuesday afternoon, Mike called my cell phone. His voice was tight with controlled excitement, the way it used to sound back when we'd stumbled onto something significant during investigations. He told me we needed to meet in person, that what he'd found was too sensitive to discuss over the phone. I asked him to just tell me, but he insisted this required a face-to-face meeting. I could hear in his voice that whatever he'd discovered was substantial. Wednesday morning, I drove my 2015 Ford F-150, paid for in cash, ran perfectly, another thing Brian had mocked as ancient and inefficient, to Mike's office in a small professional building downtown. Mike had coffee waiting for me and a thick folder sitting on his desk. He told me he'd been doing investigative work for 15 years since retiring from the state police. He'd seen embezzlement, fraud, money laundering, identity theft, every kind of financial crime imaginable. But Brian Masterson, he said, was either incredibly arrogant or incredibly stupid. Possibly both. Mike opened the folder and started laying out documents on the desk in front of me. He started with Brian's business. Masterson Properties looked successful on the surface. Nice office, professional website, seemed to close deals regularly. But when you examined the actual finances, the picture was drastically different. The business was leveraged to the absolute ceiling. Business loans, personal loans, credit cards maxed out to their limits. Brian owed approximately $240,000 in various debts across multiple institutions. Mike showed me a spreadsheet he'd compiled showing Brian's financial obligations. The list was extensive and frankly shocking. Most of that debt came from gambling. Brian had a serious problem that he'd been hiding. Mike had found records of him at 3 different casinos in Atlantic City, regular visits every few weeks for the past several years. He was on several casino comp lists, which meant he was spending enough money to get their attention and earn preferential treatment. Mike had talked to a contact who worked casino security, off the record, naturally, and they'd confirmed Brian Masterson was known as a whale at the poker tables. Not because he was good at poker, because he lost big and lost consistently. I stared at the numbers. $240,000 in debt from gambling addiction. Mike continued. The affairs Jennifer had mentioned weren't limited to just 2 women. Mike had found evidence of 5 different affairs over the past 3 years alone. Hotel receipts, restaurant charges, expensive gifts purchased on credit cards that were already maxed out. One of the women had actually filed a restraining order against Brian last year when he started showing up at her workplace after she ended the relationship. The restraining order had eventually been dropped, but the record existed in the court system. 5 women. 5 separate affairs while my daughter was dying and my wife before her. Mike still wasn't finished with his report. Brian's real estate business was also ethically questionable at best. Mike had found 3 formal complaints filed with the State Real Estate Commission over the past 4 years. Clients claiming he'd misrepresented properties, hidden inspection issues, pressured them into bad deals that benefited his commission but hurt their interests. Nothing had resulted in his license being suspended, but there was definitely a pattern of ethical violations building in his file. Several other real estate agents Mike had interviewed off the record described Brian as aggressive, dishonest, and only interested in himself rather than his clients. Then Mike pulled out another document and told me this was the really interesting part. About 2 months ago, right around the time when Sarah got seriously sick and was hospitalized, Brian had taken out a personal loan for $50,000. To secure that loan, he'd used my address as collateral on the application. He'd listed himself as co-owner of 847 Maple Street on official loan documents. My jaw clenched involuntarily. I said what Mike was already thinking, that's fraud. Mike agreed. That was definitely fraud. Brian had used a false claim of property ownership to secure a substantial loan. That was a felony in Virginia, punishable by significant prison time. Mike had obtained copies of the complete loan application with Brian's signature clearly visible on multiple pages. I sat there absorbing all this information that Mike had compiled. The gambling addiction burning through hundreds of thousands of dollars. The serial affairs with 5 different women while his wife was dying. The pattern of business ethics violations showing disregard for clients and regulations. The fraudulent loan application using my property as collateral without my knowledge or permission. Brian Masterson wasn't just an arrogant son-in-law trying to steal my house. He was a desperate man drowning in debt, willing to lie and cheat and commit actual crimes to keep his head above water and maintain his lifestyle. And my daughter had been married to this man, had died possibly not knowing, or maybe knowing but not wanting to accept, just how deeply his problems ran and how fundamentally dishonest he was. I asked Mike if I could get copies of everything he'd compiled. He told me he'd already made a complete set for me and tapped the folder on his desk. But then he asked what I was planning to do with all this information, because if I was thinking about confronting Brian directly, that could be dangerous given how desperate he clearly was. I told Mike I wasn't going to confront Brian. Not yet anyway. I was going to let him think he was winning for a little while longer. Let him keep digging his own hole deeper and deeper until he'd trapped himself completely. Mike looked at me with understanding. We'd known each other for more than 40 years. He understood exactly how I operated and how I thought strategically. He just told me to be careful, that desperate men do desperate things when they're cornered. That same afternoon, I received a certified letter delivered to the house. It was from Brian's attorney, a lawyer named Gregory Hammond from a firm called Hammond & Associates. The letter was everything I'd expected. Formal, threatening, full of legal language specifically designed to intimidate people who didn't understand their rights. It claimed that Brian Masterson had significant ownership interests in the property at 847 Maple Street through his marriage to Sarah Harrison Masterson. It demanded that I vacate the premises within 30 days or face formal eviction proceedings. It suggested that my advanced age and potential cognitive decline might be affecting my judgment and recommended I seek appropriate medical evaluation and perhaps consider the appointment of a legal guardian. I read it twice, taking note of every threat and every legal claim Hammond was making. Then I set it aside and made a phone call. I called Marcus Martinez, Joe's nephew who specialized in property law and elder rights. I told him I thought it was time we talked about legal representation. Marcus invited me to his office the next day. He was in his early 30s, sharp-eyed and intense, with his Marine Corps service evident in everything from the way he carried himself to the photos on his office wall showing him in dress blues at various ceremonies. He told me his Uncle Joe had mentioned I might call, and that Joe had said I was one of the good ones, a real soldier's soldier. I told Marcus I appreciated that and mentioned that his uncle had saved my life in Da Nang. Marcus smiled and said Joe told that story at every family gathering, about how I'd pulled him out of an ambush after he took shrapnel in the leg. I corrected him gently, explaining it had been my turn to save Joe since he'd already pulled me out of trouble 3 times before that firefight. We spent a few minutes talking about military service, about his deployment to Iraq, about the challenges of transitioning back to civilian life, and finding purpose after the structure of military service. Then I showed him the letter from Brian's attorney. Marcus read it carefully, his expression growing darker and more angry with each paragraph. When he finished, he said bluntly that it was garbage, pure intimidation tactics with no legal merit whatsoever. He explained that Hammond was known in the legal community for exactly this kind of bluster. Hammond represented lots of real estate developers and property investors, people who made money by pushing around individuals who didn't know their rights or couldn't afford to fight back. I asked if Hammond could actually make the eviction happen. Marcus said not a chance, absolutely impossible given the clear property records. But Hammond would try to make the process expensive and unpleasant, hoping I'd give up or run out of money or just decide it wasn't worth the fight. The problem, Marcus explained, was that they were clearly banking on me not being able to afford a prolonged legal battle. These kinds of cases could drag on for months or even years. Attorney fees could easily run into tens of thousands of dollars. They were counting on financial pressure forcing me to surrender. I asked what his hourly rate was. He quoted me a number that was reasonable, especially for someone with his expertise and military background and specialization in elder law. I told him I could afford it. My military pension was more substantial than Brian assumed. I also had disability benefits, and I'd done consulting work for 15 years after retirement. I wasn't wealthy, but I was far from broke. Marcus leaned forward across his desk. He said that before we talked about money or strategy, he needed to know something important. What was my actual goal here? Did I just want to defend my property rights and stay in my house? Or did I want something more than that? I thought about my daughter, about Sarah dying in that hospital bed, making me promise to try to get along with Brian. About Margaret warning me years before that Brian saw people as assets rather than human beings. About 5 affairs and $200,000 in gambling debts and fraudulent loan applications using my property. I told Marcus I wanted justice. For Sarah. For Margaret. For every single time Brian had disrespected my service and my life because he thought I was just some simple soldier living on government handouts. I wanted him to understand exactly who he'd tried to push around and what happens when you underestimate people based on age and assumptions. Marcus smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a warrior recognizing a fellow warrior preparing for battle. He said we should build a case that would make Brian regret every assumption he'd ever made about me. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus and I worked together systematically and methodically. He requested official property records, tax documents, mortgage histories, building permits, every piece of paper that documented my ownership of 847 Maple Street. I provided decades of financial records showing every payment I'd made on the house, every improvement I'd funded, every tax bill I'd satisfied promptly, every insurance premium I'd paid. Marcus deposed Brian's realtor friend who'd been present at the funeral reception when Brian discussed selling the house. The realtor was clearly uncomfortable lying under oath and admitted hearing Brian talk explicitly about removing the old man from the property and listing it for sale as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, I kept my presence in the house deliberately low-key. I spent my days in the workshop building a cabinet for one of my VFW buddies. I attended my weekly meetings at the VFW hall every Thursday night, where Joe and Dave and Mike and a dozen other veterans would gather to drink coffee and play cards and tell old war stories. One Thursday evening, Joe asked me how the mission was going. I told him the intelligence gathering phase was complete and we were moving into planning and preparation. Should be ready for execution in a few weeks. Dave asked if I needed backup. He said they all had my 6, always had and always would. I told him I knew that and might take him up on the offer when the time came for the final confrontation. Brian continued his pattern of showing up at the house every few days, always asking about my packing progress, always making comments about how stubborn I was being, how I needed to accept reality and stop fighting the inevitable. I never argued with him, never raised my voice, never gave him any emotional reaction at all. I just listened politely and went back to whatever I was doing. It drove him absolutely crazy. One afternoon when he stopped by unexpectedly, he told me he knew what my problem was. I was living in the past. I thought my military service meant something, but it didn't. Not in the real world. In the real world, what mattered was money and property and power, not medals and ribbons and following orders for 26 years. I was sanding a piece of oak at my workbench. I didn't stop working or even look up. I told him mildly that he was probably right. He seemed disappointed by my lack of reaction. He'd clearly wanted to fight, wanted me to defend my service emotionally, get upset, give him ammunition to claim I was unstable or aggressive or suffering from some kind of age-related mental decline. He told me he'd hired an attorney. A good one. Hammond and Associates. They were going to start eviction proceedings next week if I was still in the house. I mentioned that I'd received the letter. He asked what I planned to do about it. I told him I'd hired an attorney too. That surprised him visibly. He said I couldn't possibly afford a good lawyer, that legal fees would bankrupt me within months. I kept sanding the oak, watching the grain emerge smooth and clean under my hands, and told him actually I could afford it just fine. But I thanked him for his concern. He left frustrated and angry. I heard his BMW engine rev loudly as he sped away from the house, probably racing back to his office to call Hammond and complain about the stubborn old veteran who didn't know when he was beaten. 10 days before the hearing, Marcus called with significant news. The lender had received our fraud report about Brian's loan application. They'd called the loan immediately. Brian now had 30 days to repay the full $50,000, or they would file criminal charges and pursue civil remedies. I asked how Brian had reacted to this development. Marcus said according to his sources, Brian was panicking. He tried to get a loan extension, tried to refinance, tried to use his business as additional collateral. Nobody would touch him. His credit was maxed out. His business was underwater financially, and now he had a fraud investigation hanging over his head. I asked if the eviction hearing was still scheduled. Marcus confirmed it was still on. Hammond was pushing forward, probably because Brian couldn't afford to pay Hammond's fees if they dropped the case at this point. They were committed now whether they wanted to be or not. 5 days before the hearing, I got a visitor I hadn't expected at all. It was late afternoon, and I was in the workshop routing the edge of a cabinet door when I heard an unfamiliar car pull up outside. I looked out the window and saw a woman in her mid-30s climbing out of a Honda sedan, looking nervous and uncertain. I met her at the front door and asked if I could help her. She asked if I was Tom Harrison. I confirmed I was. She introduced herself as Rebecca Chun. She said she'd been one of the women Brian had an affair with about 2 years ago. She'd heard through mutual friends that I was in a legal battle with Brian over property, and she wanted to talk to me about what she knew. I invited her inside, made coffee, and listened to her story. Rebecca had been a client looking to buy her first home. Brian had been her real estate agent, charming, attentive, helpful throughout the process. The affair had started after she closed on her house. It lasted for months. When she tried to end it because she discovered he was married, Brian became aggressive. He showed up at her workplace repeatedly. He called her constantly at all hours. He sent angry, threatening texts. She'd eventually filed a restraining order, which Brian's previous lawyer had fought hard and eventually got dismissed by agreeing Brian would stay away from her completely. She told me she hadn't known Brian was married until after they'd been involved for more than a month. When she found out, she ended it immediately. But Brian wouldn't accept the breakup. He told her his wife was dying anyway, that Rebecca was being unreasonable, that they could be together openly soon enough if she just waited patiently. Rebecca pulled out her phone. She told me she'd kept everything. All the text messages, all the voicemails, every piece of evidence. She'd been terrified to do anything with them because Brian had threatened to sue her for defamation if she told anyone about their relationship. But when she heard I was fighting him over a house that had belonged to my daughter, when she learned more about the situation, she wanted me to have all these messages. She said they showed what kind of person Brian really was. I accepted her offer to email me everything she had. After she left, I immediately forwarded it all to Marcus. His response came within an hour. Just 3 words. This destroys him. 3 days before the hearing, Brian showed up at the house one final time. He looked terrible. Unshaven, rumpled suit, dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. The confident, arrogant real estate agent had been completely replaced by someone who looked desperate and cornered and frightened. He said we needed to talk. I told him we could talk at the hearing. He said no, we needed to talk now, right now. He said he'd made some mistakes, and he knew that. But we could work this out. We didn't need lawyers and courts and all this drama. I asked what he was proposing. He hesitated, then said he'd drop the eviction case. I could stay in the house. We'd just forget this whole thing had ever happened. I asked what he wanted in exchange. He said he needed me to not report that loan to the bank. Tell them it was a misunderstanding, that I'd given him permission to list the property. He said please, actually begged. He said the bank was going to press criminal charges. He could go to jail. I looked at him standing on the porch of my house, the house he'd tried to steal, the house he'd used for fraud, the house where my wife and daughter had lived and laughed and made memories he'd never cared about or respected. I said no. He started pleading. I interrupted him. I told him he'd had 5 affairs while my daughter was dying. He'd run up $200,000 in gambling debt. He'd lied on a loan application using my property. He'd thrown away my military medals and called them junk. He'd called me a government freeloader at Sarah's funeral. He'd given me 72 hours to get out of my own house 2 days after we buried my daughter. My voice was still calm and measured, but there was steel running through every word now. I told him I'd given him chances. So many chances to be decent, to be honest, to show even minimal respect. He'd chosen who he wanted to be at every single decision point. Now he got to live with those choices and face their consequences. He said I was destroying his life. I told him no. He'd destroyed his own life through his own choices and actions. I was just making sure everyone knew the truth about what he'd done. I closed the door in his face. The courthouse was a modern building downtown, all glass and steel and polished marble floors that echoed with footsteps as Marcus and I walked toward the courtroom. It was 9 in the morning on a Tuesday, and the hallways were filled with the usual chaos of the legal system. Lawyers and clients hurrying past, people in suits carrying briefcases, families sitting on benches waiting nervously for their cases to be called. I was wearing my service uniform. I hadn't worn it in years. It had been hanging in a garment bag in the back of my closet since Margaret's funeral 4 years ago. But Marcus had suggested it might be appropriate for the hearing, and I'd agreed completely. Not the dress blues, nothing too formal or theatrical. Just the standard Army service uniform with my rank insignia clearly visible, my ribbons arranged in proper order, my badges positioned exactly where regulations specified. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas E. Harrison, United States Army, retired. Let Brian and his lawyers see exactly who they'd been trying to push around and intimidate. We arrived early, taking seats on a bench outside the courtroom. Marcus had his briefcase full of documents, everything organized with the kind of precision that came from military training, labeled tabs, index sections, everything ready for immediate access when needed. Marcus asked if I was ready for this. I told him I'd been ready for 40 years. This was considerably easier than the intelligence briefings I used to give to generals and colonels who could end your career with a single word if you weren't absolutely prepared. At 9:15, Brian arrived with his lawyer Gregory Hammond. Hammond was exactly what I'd expected from Mike's description. Late 50s, expensive tailored suit, perfectly styled silver hair, the kind of lawyer who'd built a successful career intimidating people who couldn't afford to fight back. He had that confident swagger of someone who'd won too many easy victories against unprepared opponents and had forgotten what real resistance looked like. Brian looked substantially worse than he had 3 days earlier when he'd showed up at my door begging. His suit was wrinkled like he'd slept in it. His tie was crooked. His face was pale and drawn with deep shadows under his eyes. When he saw me sitting on that bench in my uniform with my rank and ribbons clearly displayed, his steps actually faltered mid-stride. Hammond noticed me too. His expression flickered for just a moment with something that might have been concern or uncertainty. But he recovered quickly, plastering on his professional courtroom smile. Hammond approached with his hand extended, introducing himself and saying he represented Brian Masterson. He said he was sure we could resolve this matter quickly and amicably without wasting the court's time. I stood and shook his hand. My grip was firm and steady. His was aggressive, that dominating handshake some men use to try to establish superiority from the first moment of contact. I told him I was sure we could resolve it too, by me keeping my house and his client facing the full consequences of his fraudulent loan application. Hammond's smile didn't waver at all. He said he thought I'd find that the legal reality of the situation was considerably more complex than I understood. Property law could be quite intricate for those without legal training, he explained in a patronizing tone. I agreed that he was absolutely right. That's exactly why I'd hired an attorney. Marcus Martinez, I said, Marine Corps veteran and property law specialist. I thought Hammond would find Marcus understood the legal intricacies quite well. Marcus stepped forward and shook Hammond's hand. The two lawyers sized each other up. Hammond with his decades of experience and courtroom victories, Marcus with his youth and military bearing and absolute confidence in the strength of our case. Hammond gestured toward the courtroom door and suggested we proceed. Judge Patricia Morrison presided over the hearing. She was in her early 60s with short gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss absolutely nothing. According to Marcus, she had a well-deserved reputation for being no-nonsense, scrupulously fair, and completely intolerant of attorneys who wasted her time with weak cases or theatrical nonsense. We took our seats at the respective tables, Brian and Hammond on one side, Marcus and I on the other. The courtroom was mostly empty except for a few observers, some law students taking notes, and people waiting for later cases on the docket. And sitting in the back row were 6 men in their 70s, all wearing VFW caps and blazers. Joe Martinez, Dave Chun, Mike Peterson, Bill Sanders, my former commanding officer, Carl Wright, who'd served with me in Germany during the Cold War, and Tommy Lee, who'd been my platoon sergeant in Vietnam and had carried me 2 miles through hostile territory after I took shrapnel in my leg. They'd come without me asking or even telling them about the hearing. They'd come because that's what soldiers do. We show up for each other when it matters, no questions asked, no explanations needed. Brian saw them sitting there, and his face went even paler than it already was. Judge Morrison called the case to order. She identified the motion as an eviction filing by Brian Masterson against Thomas Harrison regarding the property at 847 Maple Street. She told Hammond he'd filed the motion, so he should make his case first. Hammond stood smoothly, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced ease. He thanked the judge and launched into his argument. This case was straightforward, he claimed. His client Brian Masterson had been married to Sarah Harrison Masterson, daughter of the defendant Thomas Harrison. When Mrs. Masterson tragically passed away 3 months ago, his client became entitled to his late wife's property interests through standard inheritance laws. The property in question at 847 Maple Street had been the marital residence of Mr. and Mrs. Masterson for the past 8 years. Hammond pulled out documents and presented them to the court clerk, who passed them to Judge Morrison. He pointed out that the records showed Mr. and Mrs. Masterson had lived at that address continuously from 2017 until Mrs. Masterson's death. The defendant, Mr. Harrison, had also resided at the address, Hammond acknowledged, but as a guest of the young couple. Now that Mrs. Masterson had passed away, his client wished to exercise his rights as property owner. Unfortunately, Mr. Harrison had refused to vacate despite multiple reasonable requests, forcing them to seek court intervention. Hammond paused for dramatic effect. He said he wanted to emphasize that they had great sympathy for Mr. Harrison's situation. He was elderly, he was grieving the loss of his daughter, and they understood completely that this transition was difficult for him. However, the law was clear and unambiguous. Property rights had to be respected. His client had been more than patient, giving Mr. Harrison multiple opportunities to relocate voluntarily to a more appropriate living situation. They were simply asking the court to enforce the legal reality of property ownership. Hammond sat down looking satisfied with his presentation. Judge Morrison turned to our table and called on Marcus. Marcus stood. Unlike Hammond's theatrical presentation, Marcus was direct and economical with his words. Marine Corps efficiency applied to legal argument. He told the judge that Hammond's entire case rested on a completely false premise, that Sarah Masterson had any ownership interest whatsoever in 847 Maple Street. She did not. She never had. The property had been solely owned by his client Thomas Harrison since he purchased it in 1978. Marcus handed documents to the court clerk, who passed them to Judge Morrison. He explained these were the complete deed records for the property spanning from 1978 to the present. As the judge would clearly see, only 2 names had ever appeared on that deed: Thomas Harrison and his late wife Margaret Harrison. When Mrs. Margaret Harrison passed away in 2019, Mr. Thomas Harrison became sole owner through standard survivorship provisions. Sarah Masterson's name had never appeared on the deed at any point. She had no ownership interest to pass on to her husband through inheritance. Judge Morrison was studying the documents Marcus had provided, her expression growing progressively more stern with each page. Marcus continued calmly. Furthermore, he said, they had documented evidence that Mr. Brian Masterson had engaged in fraud regarding this property. Specifically, he had obtained a $50,000 personal loan approximately 2 months ago by falsely claiming to be a co-owner of 847 Maple Street on his loan application. Marcus said they had the application right here, signed by Mr. Masterson, listing himself as property co-owner, a completely fraudulent claim. Hammond jumped up immediately. He said the loan application was not relevant to this eviction proceeding and shouldn't be admitted. Marcus said calmly that it was extremely relevant because it demonstrated Mr. Masterson's pattern of making false claims about property he didn't own. It also established his motive in this entire case. He wasn't trying to claim his late wife's property through legitimate inheritance. He was trying to steal his father-in-law's property to satisfy substantial gambling debts and other financial obligations. Judge Morrison raised her hand for silence. She told both attorneys to sit down and be quiet while she reviewed the documents they'd submitted. The courtroom went completely silent except for the sound of pages turning as Judge Morrison read through everything carefully. Her expression grew darker and more severe with each document she examined. After what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably closer to 5. Judge Morrison looked up. She looked directly at Hammond with an expression that could have frozen water. She said she'd reviewed the deed records. They were absolutely clear and unambiguous. Thomas Harrison had purchased the property in 1978. His name was on the deed. His wife's name had been added later and removed upon her death. Sarah Masterson's name appeared nowhere in the chain of title. She asked Hammond what possible legal basis he had for claiming Brian Masterson had any ownership interest in this property. Hammond stood and tried to argue that in a marriage, spouses often have implicit property rights even if their names aren't on deeds, that there were equitable claims to consider, that his client had contributed to the household for 8 years. Judge Morrison cut him off. She said that was nonsense. Virginia was not a community property state. Property belonged to whoever's name was on the deed unless there was explicit documentation otherwise. She asked if Hammond had any such documentation. Hammond admitted he did not, but maintained his client had reasonable expectations based on living at the property. Judge Morrison said expectations weren't ownership. She said frankly she was shocked this case had even been filed given how weak it was. Then she turned to the loan application documents Marcus had provided. She asked Hammond if he'd been aware his client had fraudulently claimed to own this property on a loan application. Hammond's face went red. He said he'd only just learned of that, and it wasn't relevant to the eviction motion before the court today. Judge Morrison said it was absolutely relevant because it showed his client had knowingly and deliberately made false claims about owning property that didn't belong to him. It established a pattern of fraudulent behavior. She asked Marcus if he'd reported this to the lender. Marcus confirmed he had. The lender had called the loan and reported it to law enforcement for potential criminal prosecution. Judge Morrison nodded. She said that was appropriate. Then she asked me to stand. I stood at attention the way I'd been trained to do decades ago. Judge Morrison asked about my military service. I told her I'd served 26 years in the United States Army, retiring in 1995 as a lieutenant colonel. I'd done 2 tours in Vietnam with the 173rd Airborne and then spent the remainder of my career in military intelligence. She asked if I'd purchased the property with a VA loan. I confirmed that I had. She asked if I'd paid off that loan. I told her yes, completely paid off in 2000 after 22 years of payments, never once late. She asked if I'd ever given Brian Masterson any reason to believe he had ownership rights to the property. I said absolutely not. My daughter and her husband had lived there as my guests after my wife became ill. I'd never transferred any ownership interest or made any promises about inheritance. Judge Morrison thanked me and told me to sit down. Then she turned back to Hammond. Her voice was cold and hard. She said she was denying the eviction motion in its entirety. There was no legal basis for it whatsoever. Mr. Harrison was the sole owner of the property and had every right to remain there. Mr. Masterson had no claim to the property through his marriage because his late wife had never owned any interest in it. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, she was deeply troubled by the fraudulent loan application. She was going to note in her order that evidence of potential fraud had been presented and that appropriate authorities had been notified. If Mr. Masterson was facing criminal charges related to that fraud, that was entirely his own doing. Hammond tried to object or ask for reconsideration. Judge Morrison cut him off sharply. She said the motion was denied, the case was closed, and if Hammond brought another frivolous case like this into her courtroom, she'd report him to the state bar for filing without merit. The hearing was over in less than 30 minutes. We stood as Judge Morrison left the courtroom. Hammond was gathering his papers frantically, his face still red with either embarrassment or anger. Brian was sitting frozen at the table, staring straight ahead like he couldn't process what had just happened. Marcus and I walked out of the courtroom together. In the hallway, my 6 brothers from the VFW were waiting. Joe clapped me on the shoulder. Dave shook my hand. Mike gave me a tight hug. Bill Sanders, my former CO, told me I'd executed the mission perfectly. The weeks that followed brought a steady stream of consequences for Brian. Marcus called me 3 days after the hearing to let me know the final order had been signed by Judge Morrison. The language was clear and unambiguous. I was confirmed as the sole owner of 847 Maple Street. Brian Masterson had no claim to the property whatsoever. He was ordered to have no further contact with me. He was ordered to pay my attorney's fees, which totaled just over $8,000. And the order specifically noted that evidence of fraudulent loan applications had been presented and referred to appropriate law enforcement authorities. 3 weeks after the hearing, I got word through Mike's investigation network that criminal charges had been filed against Brian. The state prosecutor had charged him with felony fraud for the loan application, felony perjury for lying in the eviction case, and several misdemeanor charges related to filing false documents. If convicted on all counts, he was looking at potential prison time of 3 to 5 years plus substantial fines plus restitution. Brian's real estate license had been suspended pending investigation by the state licensing board. His business had officially closed. He'd filed for bankruptcy protection, listing debts of more than $300,000 against assets of less than $20,000. Everything had completely fallen apart for him in less than 2 months. 6 months after our court hearing, Brian's criminal trial happened. He pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a sentencing recommendation of 2 years in prison. The judge accepted the plea deal. Brian went to prison. His real estate license was permanently revoked. His bankruptcy was finalized. His life as he'd known it was completely over. 1 year after Sarah's death, I held a small memorial service in the backyard of the house on Maple Street. Jennifer came, along with some of Sarah's teacher friends. My military brothers came. Some neighbors who'd known Sarah came. We planted a dogwood tree in Margaret's garden in Sarah's memory, choosing a spot where it would get morning sun the way Sarah had always loved. We shared stories about Sarah, her kindness, her patience with struggling students, her terrible jokes that made everyone groan, her competitive streak that came out during family game nights, her love of mystery novels and terrible reality TV shows. We laughed and cried and remembered her as she'd been before the cancer, before Brian, when she was just my daughter living her life and bringing joy to everyone around her. After everyone left, I sat in Margaret's chair looking out at the garden where the new dogwood tree stood. I thought about my wife and my daughter, both gone too soon. I thought about the house where we'd built our lives together. I thought about Brian's attempt to take it away and my successful defense of it. I thought about my promise to Sarah in the hospital and how I'd tried to honor it. I thought about justice, not revenge, but justice. The difference mattered to me. I hadn't tried to destroy Brian out of spite or anger. I'd simply defended what was mine and exposed the truth about what he'd done. The destruction of his life had come from his own actions, not from any vendetta on my part. I'm Tom Harrison, 72 years old. I'm a retired lieutenant colonel who served my country for 26 years. I'm a widower and a father who lost his daughter too soon. I'm a veteran who refused to be pushed around by someone who mistook age for weakness and retirement for helplessness. This is my house. I earned it. I paid for it. I defended it. And I'll live in it for whatever time I have left, surrounded by memories of the people I loved and the life we built together. Anyone who thinks otherwise is welcome to try to prove their claim. But they should be prepared to face an old soldier who never forgot how to fight, how to plan, how to win. The military taught me many things over 26 years of service. But the most important lesson was this: discipline beats arrogance every single time. Preparation beats assumption. Strategy beats brute force. And a determined veteran with right on his side is a force to be reckoned with, regardless of age. Brian Masterson learned that lesson the hard way. His life was the price of his education. I'm sitting here now in my home, in my chair, looking at my garden, drinking my coffee. I'm at peace. The mission is complete. Justice has been served. And to anyone listening to this story who's facing something similar, someone trying to push you around because they think you're too old or too weak or too simple to fight back, remember this: you're stronger than they think. You're smarter than they assume. And you have brothers and sisters who've served alongside you who will stand with you when it matters. Never mistake an old soldier's patience for weakness. Never assume a veteran's quiet dignity means helplessness. And never, ever try to steal from someone who spent decades defending this country and learning how to defend themselves. We earned our place in this world through service and sacrifice. We don't give it up just because someone assumes we should. Stand your ground. Know your rights. Use your training. And win your battles with honor and discipline. That's what I did. That's what any veteran would do when pushed too far. This is Tom Harrison, signing off. Stay strong, fellow veterans. And thank you for listening to my story.